We agree and we advocate that developed countries should be more responsible in combating climate change than developing countries. So, climate change is a long-term alteration of Earth's climate caused by human activities, primarily the emissions of greenhouse gases, resulting in rising temperatures and a range of negative impacts on the environment and society. Indeed, throughout their history, developing countries have emitted billions of tons of greenhouse gases and generate substantial amounts of waste, contributing significantly to the climate crisis. However, despite being major contributors to the problem, these countries have failed to take adequate measures to address these issues. Our team firmly supports that the affirmative position that developed countries should be more responsible in combating climate change. We present following three arguments in support of our positions. First, developed countries have a historical and current responsibility for their significant contribution to emissions, especially during the Industrial Revolution, which had a profound impact on global climate change. Despite this, many countries continue to emit high levels of greenhouse gases and have been insufficiently proactive in addressing the climate crisis. Second, high-income countries have contributed more to climate change in terms of CO2 emissions and environmental waste. Last but not least, developed countries have the most significant capacity to combat climate change because of their finance. So let's start with the key debater one, Hương Giang.
Okay, thanks for inviting me. As the first speaker, will talk about the first argument. We believe that wealthy nations have to be responsible for the historical contribution to climate change. I also have three main claims to support our argument that developed countries are blamed in turn for being the pioneers in provoking climate change and the largest amounts of emission in long-term perspective and unfulfilled commitment to supporting third world countries. Well, first of all, I'd like to state that developed countries are more likely to be the pioneers in provoking climate change since the invention of steam engines in the 18th century. Developed countries such as Ireland have witnessed a transition into an energy-rich economy. Our claim is based on the United Nations Charter below, which has suggested that the US and UK were the first countries or trendsetters in exploiting coal, and not until the 20th century, when the developing countries such as China and India followed the developed countries. The big question here now is how coal production and consumption are related to climate change. As a matter of fact, the carbon dioxide we emit when we burn coal will stay in our atmosphere for a long time, from 30 years to thousands of years. Therefore, the part emissions are remarkably related to today's greenhouse impact, and the ones that trigger to rapid climate change are the developed countries. Secondly, in terms of time, the largest amount of emissions were created by wealthy nations, which result in long-term climate change effects. Coal consumption can be taken as a prominent example. Investigating the chart, its citizens in three most powerful countries, namely the US, the UK, and Japan, consumed the biggest amount of coal per year from 1965 to 2010. Meanwhile, the coal consumption in less developed countries had just been accelerated for the past 2 decades. It is argued that Emissions from coal consumption in developing countries also negatively impact climate change. However, considering the capacities of greenhouse gas emission from developed countries over such a long period of time, the amount of emission in the developing countries is negligible in comparison. So, who should make the world deal with climate change? No one else but developed countries. Last but not least, wealthy nations have not fulfilled their commitment to helping the poor countries to cope with climate change. In fact, the approvals in the Paris Agreement in 2010 indicated that developed countries provide financial support to developing countries to meet the huge cost of adaptation actions, particularly to the Green Climate Fund, would be $100 million. It is undeniable that many European countries have succeeded and gained a lot of benefits from this fund. However, by 2019, the actual amount of money subsidized has only accounted for 20% of the total budget. With the commitment of the rich countries, they are urged to make many more attempts to empower poor countries to cope with climate change financially. For all these reasons, I firmly believe that developed nations must take a responsibility for their historical contribution to climate change. I mean, the wealthy countries are the ones taking more responsibility for combating climate change. And now, let's move on to the second argument with Bear.
Thank you, Zhang. And now let's continue with our claim number 2. In recent years, high-income countries contribute more to climate change in terms of carbon dioxide emission and environmental waste. We have 2 reasons to support our claim. To begin with, developed countries create the most significant emitters per capita. Since the beginning of industrialization, the presence of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has skyrocketed, which is mainly caused by the combustion of fossil fuels. And the excessive amount of carbon dioxide emissions makes the proportion of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere skyrocket, which is caused mainly by the air pollution, the so-called global warming, and the acidifications of the oceans. Remarkably, the countries with the most significant carbon dioxide emissions are some of the world's largest oil and gas producers. According to a survey in 2017, Qatar had the highest emissions at 49 tons per capita, followed by Trinidad at 30 tons and Australia at 17 tons. And in 2021, there was a positive side of progress that every country, including Qatar, Trinidad, and Australia, might have struggled to reduce the emissions of carbon dioxide. However, these developed countries continue to contribute the most significant amount of carbon dioxide per person. Qatar emitted about 34 tons of carbon dioxide per person, and followed by Trinidad and Australia with 21 tons and 14 tons per capita, respectively. At the same time, the amount of emission per capita emitted by developing countries is less noticeable. For example, China just contributes about 8 tons per capita, and Vietnam just released only 3 tons per person, and India emitted about 2 tons per person. This means that individuals in developed nations are more responsible for the continuing global warming, and so more obligated to cut emissions and solve the problems. These individuals, therefore, they have to pressure their governments to take greater action on their behalf. And the next argument I'd like to state is that high-income countries are increasing more environmental waste than low-income countries. A study revealed in 2002 says that greenhouse gas emissions from waste are the highest in North America, Europe, and Australia and New Zealand. In Australia, according to ASIS Money Smart website, the average family spends $279 a week on food and drink. Considering the fact that each household throws out at least $1,036 of groceries each year, Australians throw out 10 billion of food every year, and 4 million tons of food ends up in landfill annually. This not only worsening the hidden hunger problem in Australia, it is also putting devastating pressure on the environment. Furthermore, in New Zealand, the average New Zealander produces more than 20 kilograms of e-waste every year, one of the highest per capita amounts on the planet. Yet, is the only country in entire OECD standing for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development without a national e-waste scheme. One typical example you have to consider is how much electronic waste is being created by the richest people from developed countries. According to the data updated in 2023, the United States got rid of about 7,000 kilotons of e-waste, followed by Germany, the UK, and France with about 2,000 kilotons of e-waste. However, what are the developed countries are doing? The United States Census Bureau recently published complete 2018 export data for shipments of plastic waste, officially called waste pairing and scrap, generated in the United States and sent to other poorer countries. The actual amount of United States plastic waste that ends up in the countries with poor waste management may be even higher than 78% since countries like Canada and South Korea may re-export U.S. plastic waste. And the data also indicates that the United States continue to export about as much plastic waste to countries with poor waste management as we recycle domestically. The conversation reports that in Vietnam, more than half of the plastic imported into the country is sold onto craft villages, where it is processed informally, mainly on a household scale. Informal processing involves washing and melting the plastic, which use a lot of water and energy and produce a lot of smoke. Burning plastic can produce harmful air pollutants such as dioxins and furans. So why do those developed regions create those dreadful environmental waste and let the poorer nations take responsibility for their actions and be hunted by devastating consequences? So for all these reasons, we fully believe that developed nations need to do more to tackle the negative impacts of climate change and limit their effects on underdeveloped countries. So that is our claim number 2. Now let's move to claim number 3 with Bảo Ngọc.
Hi, I'm Ngọc. I represent my group to show the view that developed countries have a greater capacity financial to combat climate change than developing countries. Climate change is a phenomenon that will have a global impact. Of course, nations will be affected to different degrees, although the problem is a global one. Developed nations that are heavily industrialized usually release more greenhouse gases per capita than developing ones. Therefore, developed nations, which led the Industrial Revolution and are responsible for most of the greenhouse gases now in the atmosphere, have to bear a greater responsibility for combating climate change. We assert that it is not a subjective opinion of our group that developed countries have to spend more money on climate change. In 2015, the Paris Agreement, often referred to as the Paris Accord or the Paris Climate Accord, an international treaty on climate change, was negotiated by 196 parties at the 2015 United Nations Climate Change Conference near Paris, France. Moreover, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, another international environmental treaty to combat dangerous human interference with the climate system, was adopted in 1992 with the ultimate aim of preventing dangerous human interference with the climate system. Both the convention and the agreement agree that developed countries should take more responsibility for climate change around the world. The Paris Agreement stipulates very clearly in Article 4.4 that developed countries are expected to take the lead in setting ambitious emission reduction targets due to their greater responsibility and capital to make significant reduction in emissions. And in Article 9.1, the pledge also states that developed countries have agreed with the commitment to mobilize $100 a year in climate finance by 2020 and agreed to continue mobilizing finance at this level until 2025. The money is for supporting an adaptation in developing countries are in United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Article 3.1 said, "The principle of common but differentiated responsibility acknowledges that developed nations have a greater responsibility to take action on climate change due to their historical and current greenhouse gas emissions and their greater capacity to address the problem." This means the developed countries agree that they need to spend more money than developing countries on climate change because of their greater responsibility and capacity. Besides that, I want to add one more point that most developing countries also have more problems with poverty and slow development than developed countries. They need to care about the economic development and basic demands of humans more, so the amount of money they could be spent on environmental protection is negligible. Furthermore, some countries most exposed to heat waves, droughts, and sea level rise often confront other pressing development needs. For example, South Africa, whose countries have always suffered from record-breaking heat waves and a shortage of necessities due to year-round crop failures. In this situation, the interstate budgets will mostly have to be poured into people living expense, and even their country has to borrow debt from developed countries to be able to reach a temporary level and maintain a stable life. In summary, developing countries are though directly affected or suffering devastating impacts of climate change even though they're not or little responsible for causing it. So developed can help poor and developing countries adapt by providing financial support and developing institutional capacity. Investing in climate resilience can also be financially efficient for development partners because upfront investment in protection can be less expensive than humanitarian relief and reconstruction after a disaster.